My name is Rajagopalan, and this is the webinar for the Supply Chain Management Program at the Marshall School of Business. I hope you enjoy this webinar, and if you have questions based on this, feel free to contact us. So what we're going to do is just to give you a flavor for what we're going to do in the Supply Chain Management Program. I'm going to take you through a simple example of a successful company in the arena of supply chain management in a fairly challenging environment. And this company is a company called Zara, which is a Spanish-based company, a Spain-based company. It's in the apparel business. Some of you may have heard of this company either in the context of your business or as a consumer. So Zara is not a very old company in the sense most of their success has been well known only for the past 5 years or so, okay? Maybe 6-7 years. Let's look at what makes them so successful. Okay? To do that, let's first understand what happens in a classic apparel business. What happens in a classic apparel business is you have very long lead times. Why are there long lead times? Because remember, in this business, you are essentially creating new products very frequently, because every year, for every season, you're producing a variety of different products, different sizes, different colors, different styles, different combinations, different fabrics. Even the design stage is repeated every single year. And a large apparel company would produce maybe 10,000, 20,000 styles each year, right? Or it could be as few as 5,000 or as little as 1,000. Then, after you have made your designs, you got to purchase raw materials. Then you got to manufacture them, and then you got to distribute them, and you can't ship these by air because these are not very high margin products, and then you got to sell them, right? So the lead times tend to be very, very long because design takes a fair amount of time. Then purchasing raw materials can take a long time because the lead times for some components can be very long. Then manufacturing is often in Asian countries, etc., so the lead time is long. And then distribution can take anywhere from 6 weeks just for the ocean transportation, and then a lot of transportation, let's say, within the US. So it can take 2 months, and then it comes to the retailer's shelf, and then the season starts. So if you're selling fall apparel and we want the fabrics to be available in fall, normally the planning for all this starts the previous fall. So we're talking about almost a 12-month lead time. Because of this, let's look at what happens. Typically, because you have so many different styles, so many different stock-keeping units, there's a lot of uncertainty in demand at the individual SKU level, the individual item level, product level, for a particular style, color, size, etc. So you have one of two things happen. One of the things that can happen is your demand is very much less than what you had planned, what you had produced, what you had ordered with your supplier, and you end up with a lot of excess inventory. On the other hand, your demand can be very high, but you didn't order enough, and then you're stuck with a lost opportunity, lost sales. So either of this happens, and it's very difficult to come up with a good forecast because you're producing new styles. There's a lot of uncertainty. Now, is this really true only in apparel? Not true. It's true in a variety of industries. It's true in toys. It's true for a lot of seasonal products. It's true even in products that are not seasonal. If you think about a lot of electronic products, what's been happening is life cycles have been becoming shorter and shorter. Whether you're dealing with phones, cell phones, you're dealing with cameras, life cycles are very short. And as life cycles become very short, essentially what happens is there's uncertainty in demand, and you produce a variety of different styles of products. And this creates uncertainty. Lead times are often long because you produce them in Asia or far away, especially because these days a lot of products are made globally. So you may assemble them in one place, you may buy the components in a different place, and so on. So you have long lead times coupled with uncertainty in demand. And this creates enormous challenges in supply chains, right? And the question is, how do you deal with these challenges? And in that context, let's look briefly at Zara, but this holds lessons that are deeper, and that's what we cover in the program. So if you think about Zara, it's a market that's characterized by high demand uncertainty at the SKU level. Production or supply lead times are very long. So this reduces your inability to match supply and demand. So for instance, if you think a particular style is going to sell really well, well, the question is, you can't produce it fast enough to meet demand, and because your lead times are long. On the other hand, sometimes demand can be very little, but there's nothing much you can do because you had to produce them, order them a long time before, and so that results in excess inventory. So in a sense, supply chain management is all about how do you match supply and demand as accurately as possible, right? And Zara's approach is very different from the typical apparel company. It's to rethink the entire value chain. And it's to minimize the time between supply and demand as much as possible to minimize these mismatches between supply and demand. Let's look at how they go about doing it. So if you look at Zara's strategy, it's got many elements to it. So here are just a few elements of Zara's strategy, a few key ideas. One is they develop through the design time, they shorten by developing styles very quickly. So what they do is, they don't necessarily look for complete innovation, complete creativity. Instead, they study the consumer demand, consumer preferences, and they try to come up with what are some styles that seem to be very popular. And they come up with a lot of them very quickly. And in this, they use market demand information. So that's one strategy. The other strategy is that they, unlike most other apparel manufacturers, they actually produce a lot of their fabrics in Spain within Europe, right? And most of it in Spain. So what does this do? Because they control the fabric production or they source it locally, lead times are much shorter. Of course, it's more expensive because you're sourcing the fabric in Europe as compared to, let's say, in China. Then the other thing that they do is, there's a lot more production in Europe of even the assembled product. And clearly, production costs are much lower in China. And so they do outsource some production, but they tend to outsource the basic styles there. The more fashionable, the more uncertain styles, they tend to source in Spain. But even there, they source it from lower cost regions. They don't control the production of the fabric. The fabric they control, but not the assembled garment. Instead, they outsource it to lower level, lower wage regions within Spain, Portugal, etc. So there is more production in Europe, which enables them to respond quickly to demand changes. Right? So they look at demand and then they produce, right? More if necessary. Then they have fast delivery to the store. So for instance, they replenish their stores almost twice, and they ship some of it by air, but because Europe is geographically small, they can ship even by road relatively quickly. And there is frequent replenishment, which is unheard of generally in the apparel industry. And the other interesting thing that they do is, if a particular style is very popular, sometimes they may not even replenish it. Why? Because they want to create this image in the consumer's mind that their styles are very popular and they may go out of stock, and you want to be sure you want to get it. And so people tend to visit frequently because they don't know if a really popular, great style that's fresh is going to go out of stock and they won't be able to get it. So what does this force? This forces a notion of the economics of scarcity in the consumer's mind, forcing the consumer to visit a Zara store more often. And because they visit more often, they tend to buy more often. That tends to increase demand and actually reduce demand-supply mismatches. In terms of quality, you cannot say their products are of very high quality, but they are reasonably priced, they are good quality, and they look terrific. Right? Now, so this fresh, fast approach, combined with rapid and frequent transfer of demand information from the stores back to the design area, and having some excess capacity in their production, for instance, in fabric sourcing, even in their reserve capacity with many of their assemblers, this enables them to respond quickly to demand changes. They have to pay a price for this because and that's where the cost might be higher because they have higher labor costs because they're producing mostly in Europe or quite a lot in Europe. Higher labor costs, higher costs because they have excess capacity. They have higher costs because they produce in small batches, so they cannot take advantage of setups, etc. And a lot of fabric production is within Europe. That increases cost too. But even though all these costs are higher, on the other side, they don't need as much markdowns. If you look at most apparel retailers, what happens is they produce a lot because they want to take advantage of low labor costs and economies of scale. They produce in large batches every style. And then they discount the merchandise, or if they don't sell it, they basically have to salvage it at a very, very low price. And the question is, which is better? Is it better for me to incur high labor costs or high sourcing costs, or is it better for me to have lower markdowns? And in a sense, Zara's success has shown us that this can be a great strategy, to have lower markdowns, but incur somewhat higher labor costs. But remember, it's not that Zara doesn't produce in China, but the more stable demand you want to produce in China, because anyway there is not much uncertainty in demand there. And so the supply-demand mismatches are going to be minimal. So if we think of what are the lessons from Zara, the reduction in markdown cost can be much greater and can make up for the higher labor cost, for the higher sourcing cost, the higher fabric cost in Europe. And faster response in a supply chain eliminates inventory risk. And that can be one of the biggest risks in a supply chain when you have situation where there is demand uncertainty, which is true in many, many products, and when lead times are long. And as we see in Zara's case, excess capacity can pay for itself by faster response. Now, the planned shortages can induce greater demand, greater visits to stores by consumers, thus increasing demand, thus increasing sales. And so, in a sense, what we learn is one of the most important things in a supply chain is quick response and flexibility in your design, manufacturing, and distribution network. Right? So, this Zara is a great example of where a supply chain is managed to adapt to that particular environment. And this environment is one where lead times are long, demand is very uncertain, very difficult to predict. And in those situations, quick response and flexibility is extremely important. And that's what the story of Zara indicates. Now, if you want to read further about Zara, I've just touched on a few important details. There is an article in the Harvard Business Review called Rapid Fire Fulfillment. I think this has many interesting insights for many supply chains, not just for the apparel supply chain. Now, if you want to understand this, of course, in greater depth, then you can go to our program, which is the Supply Chain Management Program, where we go through some supply chain basics and various important performance metrics for supply chains. We go through some design issues and logistics issues in supply chain. And what is important? How do you design a supply chain so that it's efficient and effective in different kinds of environments? Then we get into inventory management and risk pooling. Right? So Zara is just one example. There are many examples of successful companies that have managed their risk and inventory very well, and how to match supply and demand, and we'll see lots of examples and a lot of theory also that goes along with the examples in this session. And then we also look at forecasting, because there are situations where you can forecast pretty well, and the question is, how do you forecast? How do you manage demand? And that's what we look at in session 4. And then finally, we look at how do you more and more, especially in the past decade or so, as the amount of information available in the supply chain has increased, firms have to collaborate through things like vendor managed inventories. And the question is, how do you collaborate? How do you share information? And how do you make the supply chain much better for every party in a supply chain? And that's what this program is all about. So again, if you have any questions based on this about our program, please feel free to contact us. You got the email at the bottom there, which tells you how to contact us. Thank you very much.
One question we have is, if you're dealing with a company that's a part of your supply chain and they are slowing down your lead time, is it better to go ahead and acquire that company?
The solution is not to acquire typically. The solution is more often to provide incentives to reduce lead times. So the solution is that there may be some good reasons why lead times are long, and so it's important to understand those long lead times, why they might be so, and if necessary provide incentives for reducing those lead times. So that's one possible solution. Now sometimes it may make sense to acquire a particular company, but that's not necessarily the best solution in all situations. Where it might make sense is situations where, for instance, that company has very little capital and they are subject to a lot of uncertainties, let's say the raw material side. They cannot acquire the raw material easily. That's creating, let's say, long lead times, or they don't have the capacity, and so some capital infusion from you might help them increase their capacity, which could improve lead times. So again, it depends highly on the context as to what you would do. I am aware of situations where companies have acquired, but there are also situations where companies have actually allowed suppliers to supply them rather than them doing all the tasks. There are risks in either situation, and one has to understand the particular context of supply chain, and that's kind of what we go through in this program. It's highly context specific. The question is, what are the nature of the factors that influence this decision?
One other question. Could you provide an example of best practices in supply chain that's from another industry other than apparel?
Okay. Another example of best practices in a supply chain is certainly, if you look at retail, Walmart is a great example of managing the supply chain extremely well. So let's look at some 2 or 3 elements of why Walmart has done such a great job in managing the supply chain. So one of the reasons is Walmart, because in the retail supply chain you have a lot of different products that you stock, you source them from all over the world, and there is a lot of uncertainty, and you can have hundreds of suppliers who supply that to you, both domestically as well as internationally. The question is, how do you manage all this, the flow of information as well as the flow of materials? So what are some of the things Walmart has done to achieve this? There are some 3 or 4 major things that Walmart did, and they did it before everybody else. One of the things that they did was they were among the first to get information about inventories at all their stores real time, both for internal decision making and to transfer the information to the suppliers, so that the suppliers can make better decisions. It's easy to blame suppliers if your lead times are long or if something goes wrong in your supply chain, but the suppliers need good information to make their decisions in a sound manner. And Walmart, using satellites, using sophisticated information technologies, right from the 70s, they started managing the information flow in such a manner that the people who make the purchasing decisions, who make production planning decisions in their suppliers, have information there. So that's one. Number 2, they were the pioneer in cross-docking. So what is cross-docking? It's the ability to transfer your material as quickly as possible from the supplier to the retail stores. Material used to sit in various warehouses of the suppliers as well as Walmart's warehouses. And what did Walmart do? They came up with a wonderful innovation where they said product will come in from the suppliers to essentially a cross-dock facility, and the same day it will be sorted and shipped to the various stores in the particular region of the cross-dock. What does this do? It increases speed of flow of material. It also reduces all the handling costs. It reduces all the storage costs. It reduces and it increases your ability to respond quickly to market changes. Walmart was also a pioneer in vendor-managed inventory. And what does vendor-managed inventory do? Again, it speeds up the process. It increases the ability to share information and collaborate on the supply chain. So these are just 3 examples of strategies that a company like Walmart has used to be extremely successful in managing the supply chain, and many others have now copied many of those ideas.
If components of the supply chain are slow to respond, I'm assuming the question is referring to the initial suppliers of the supply chain, is it advantageous to invest in higher levels of inventory to store these products?
It depends upon whether the components are inexpensive. It depends upon whether the components, there are only one or multiple suppliers. If there's only one supplier for a component and you're subject to a lot of risk because the supplier may not always deliver on time, then in the short run it makes sense to hold inventories of those components. But remember, in the short run. In the long run, what you want to do is you want to understand why is there uncertainty in the supplier's ability to supply those components to you. And you may need to work with the supplier to improve that reliability, or sometimes it may make sense to have 2 or more suppliers so that there is some competition between them in terms of achieving higher levels of reliability in supplying those components to you. Remember, it's not just a question of low price. You also want reliable supply. And so that's why you have to trade that off. And it's good to have some competition on your supply side. But if you have a sole source supplier, in the short run, it makes perfect sense to hold more inventory of those components.
That's all the questions.
Okay, thank you.
One more slide.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, one
That's
more.
right. Okay, so we have finally some additional information about the executive education, the various programs that we offer, and this just gives you a sampling of that. Please feel free to go to our webpage for more information on this, or you're welcome to contact us via email or via phone. If you go to our webpage, you'll have all the information. Thank you.